Our focus, of course, as we read these verses, is on Jesus, on the agony he suffered on the cross for us. But this morning I'd like to spend a few moments thinking about some of the other characters in the story, the bit part players, as we might call them, and think what we can learn from them, from their actions and words. Take Barabbas, for instance, a notorious criminal released from prison instead of Jesus. What must he have been thinking about it all? He must have known about Jesus, must have known he was a good man, unjustly accused. Did he feel guilty at all, we might wonder, with Jesus dying in his place? And yet, of course, we can all say that Jesus died in my place. And amazingly, he did it to take our guilt away. What about Simon of Cyrene, forced to carry the cross for Jesus, who was too weak to do so himself after the beatings he'd already received? Did Simon do so grudgingly or gladly, we wonder? I can't help feeling that his life must have been profoundly changed by the experience. And if you and I want to be followers of Jesus, we too must take up our cross. We must be prepared to sometimes bear heavy loads for others. Indeed, the present circumstances will bring some extra loads for some. Then there is the Roman centurion, whose exclamation as Jesus died has reverberated down the ages. Mark begins his gospel with these words: the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And yet during his lifetime, as far as we know, though some came close to it, no one actually came to that conclusion about Jesus except this one man, the man who realized the full and the wonderful truth. Having stood next to the cross and seen how Jesus died, the centurion said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Knowing what you know about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, is that your conclusion too? I hope so. What about Joseph of Arimathea, who buried Jesus? A prominent member of the council who, Luke tells us, had not agreed with the decision to execute Jesus, because secretly, as John tells us, he was himself a follower of Jesus. And yet something about the enormity of the situation he now found himself in compelled him to put his head above the parapet, as we say, and to bravely ask Pilate for the body of Jesus. I wonder if the enormity of the situation we find ourselves in these days might prompt us to put our heads above the parapet more often than we might have done in the past, to speak about our faith in Jesus. Finally, let me mention the women who followed Jesus, often called just that, though sometimes a few are mentioned by name, and yet still followers of Jesus from the very beginning, some of them, along with the men who we tend to hear more about. Here in the Easter story, when the stakes were at their highest, the women really come into their own, arguably the real heroes of the account. They were the ones who stayed with Jesus at the cross, the ones who went to see where he was buried, and who on the third day went to the tomb to take care of his body. And they were rewarded for their faithfulness. They were as scared and confused and upset as any of the disciples. But even so, they would not leave Jesus. We may be scared and confused and upset by our present predicament. But will we, like the women, stick with Jesus through it all? We must do. We can do. Trusting that just as the women were rewarded by seeing the risen Jesus, we too, one day in the future, will also see him face to face. Do read the Easter story this week. Reflect on what you read and bring your thoughts to God in prayer. And you will be blessed.